side 2 of the World War II tape. As I said before, it was exciting being up in the foretop, and in some respects I really enjoyed it. You could see for miles when the ocean was calm, and you could see all, if we were in a convoy, you could see all the ships that were in the convoy. And when it was rough, the ship would sway from side to side. In fact, it would seem, when you look out, if you were swaying, tilting to starboard side, it would look like you were going to hit the water. And then you'd go all the way back over to the other side, on the port side, and it looked like you were going to hit the water on that side. So it was exciting and quite an experience. It turned out that it was a real plus for me to be in that situation. I'll explain that a little later. In addition to going back and forth on convoy duty, we had some interesting assignments. At one time, when we had finished convoy duty, we ended up in Scapa Flow, which is in the Orkneys and Shetland Islands north of Great Britain. It was a big naval harbor at that time. And there, something happened to us that doesn't happen to many American sailors. We were put in the British Navy. There was our ship, which was a heavy cruiser, and 2 American destroyers, and a British cruiser, and 2 British destroyers. And we were part of a group that had an assignment to go up into the Arctic Circle. And the idea was to try to draw the German fleet and planes towards us. We were to be a decoy, while there were 5 destroyers that had been loaded with what we called pogey bait, which was candy, cigarettes, mail, medical supplies, and so forth. And those 5 destroyers were to sneak up the coast and go into the Baltic Sea and into Murmansk in Russia. Now, the Americans and the English had many tankers and ships of all kinds, and naval ships also sunk on the way to Murmansk, and they had more or less cut out sending any more ships or supplies by sea, because the German submarines were sinking most of them. And all these fellas were trapped in Murmansk and had no way to get out, and a lot of them were English and then a lot of them were Americans, and they hadn't had mail for a long time, or candy or cigarettes, a lot of other things. So this was an operation to get food and supplies into them. So what happened was that the British Navy was in charge of this operation, and therefore our ship and our 2 destroyers were turned over to the British Navy. The British sent several signalmen and a handful of radiomen aboard our ship to assist us, because they sent their signals so different that most of us couldn't copy the way they transmitted. So we had to have British sailors aboard to receive the messages from the British Navy so that we'd know where we were going and what we were doing and so forth. Now, we sailors, of course, didn't have any idea what we were doing, and we weren't told anything until we came back. So this was kind of a thrilling experience, not knowing what you were doing way up there in the North Atlantic. On the way up, the ocean was very, very rough, extremely rough. We went into some really bad weather. On one occasion, there were some lines that were loose up on our bow, and one of the officers sent a boatswain's mate and 4 of his men up the deck to the bow, end of the bow, to tie down those ropes. Well, as soon as they got up there, why, the bow went down into the water, and all 5 of them were washed back along the ship. 2 of them were sent underneath the turrets and all the way down to the back of the ship, and somebody caught them there, and the other 3 went over the side. Well, we had, they called muster so that we could all, excuse me, check in to see who and how many men were missing. And they counted us, of course, and found out that these 3 guys were still missing. The destroyers that were with us were notified that we had men overboard, and they were to look for them, and there wasn't a chance in the world that they were going to find anybody. But there was one, the boatswain's mate. He stayed afloat, and one of the destroyers picked him up. The other 2, of course, they never found. Later, sometime later, after he had come back on our ship in a different port, I was standing in the chow line one time, and he was standing in front of me, and so I asked him, I said, well, what's it like to be over the side like that? He must have been pretty scared. Yeah, he said, he was an old China sailor. He'd been on the ship for many, many years. He said, that's the 3rd time I've been over the side. That's no big deal. And that's the way he was, a real tough guy, covered with tattoos. If he hadn't been a tough guy and a good swimmer, he never would have made it. But on that trip, we went zigzagging around and went up into Iceland. And we docked at Reykjavik first. Got a chance to go ashore there, and it was rather interesting. It was cold. It was in the wintertime. Had a lot of snow and ice, but we were dressed for it. And we went into the bakeries there. It was about the only place you could go into, stores. And, oh, the pastry was just out of this world. You couldn't believe. So we bought a lot of that and ate it fast as we could. Now, one thing about the Icelandic girls, I assume they're kind of like Scandinavian girls. They were very, very attractive. Every single one of them was very attractive. Of course, we had been at sea for a long time, so any girl would look attractive, but these girls were really attractive. And so most of the sailors would, try to get friendly with them and so forth and so on. These were girls that were working in the stores. But usually either the parents that were running the stores would send the girls into the back room, or if they didn't do that, they wouldn't let them talk to us anyhow. So, and I think a lot of them could speak English, and most of them I think spoke German, because Germany had done a lot of work up in Iceland and built a lot of roads and did a lot of things before the English took over Iceland. But then from there, we were only there for a matter of one day, I think, and then we went around the island, went up to Akureyri, which is in the north end of the island. And then from there, we started up into the Arctic Circle, up into North Atlantic and into the Arctic Circle. We were so close to Norway that those of us that were topside could see the shoreline. We sailors, of course, again, we didn't know what we were doing there. And we sailors thought this was absolutely ludicrous because we could get attacked at any time by submarines or ships or airplanes or whatever. They could probably even shoot at us from the shore. But we sailed around and exposed ourselves, and all of a sudden I was standing topside getting in the line for chow, and all of a sudden here comes an airplane, a German airplane, and I could see him, and he was out quite a ways, of course, but he was fairly close to the water and flying around us kind of in a circle. And our gunners on the guns, the 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter, and even some of the 5-inch guns opened up on them, but nobody hit them. And of course, then they called general quarters immediately. So I didn't see all of this. I had to run to my station. And we couldn't figure out, here these guys have been practicing all this time and couldn't even hit an airplane when we were way up there. It just didn't make sense to us. Later we found out that the officers had purposely had the gunners set their sights in such a way that there was no way they could hit this plane. The idea being that we wanted to be spotted. As I said before, we were supposed to be a decoy to try to draw out the German Navy or submarines or planes to go after us so that these destroyers could sneak up the coast. Well, we just went around kind of in a circle for a long time, and again, we wondered why we didn't take off for Iceland, or at least go south. And the airplane, of course, never came back, but unbeknown to we sailors, there were some messages that came across, but they were all in code. This plane had radioed in to the German officers on the shore and told our exact location and how many ships we had and what they were and so forth. And early on in the war, the Americans had found out how to decipher the German codes. So the Americans, not on our ship, but the Americans had been able to decode that message and found that what he had told the German officials where we were. And of course, that's exactly what they had wanted us to do. Now, whether any submarines or ships came towards us at that time to chase us away, I have no idea, because as soon as it got dark, we headed for Iceland. And that was several hundred miles away, but we went as fast as we could and stopped in Iceland and then went back into Scapa Flow. And then when we got back, why then, of course, the officers told us what we had, what our assignment had been, and then we let the British sailors off the ship, and we're back in the United States Navy again. We were never told if the British destroyers made it to Murmansk, but we had to assume that they did. This is as good a time as any to take a break and talk about why I'm recording these war stories. In any type of a war, there are hundreds and thousands of men and women that are killed and injured and captured and disabled, and a lot of service people that have served in these wars have seen too much. They've seen some of their buddies killed or injured, or their loved ones, and they just they don't care to talk about what they've been through or what they've seen or what they've done and what's happened to them. And that's very understandable. In my case, it so happens that I was very, very fortunate. I never was injured. We came close to getting sunk a few times, but never did. And I felt that it might be well to tape some of these historical events and some of the experience that I had for people in future generations that might be interested in hearing about what their grandfather or great-grandfather or whatever had done during World War II. I believe that some people just wouldn't care to talk about their experiences, and that I respect that. But in my case, as I said, I was very fortunate, and so I don't really mind doing it. Speaking of being fortunate, the fact that I was on the USS Augusta was a plus, in that we would come back to the States at least once a year, and usually that would be in the wintertime, and usually it was right around Christmas. I think that I got home on leave at least 2 Christmases and 1 New Year's. In the winter and early spring of 1944, we were in the Brooklyn Navy Yards, and a lot was happening to the ship. There was a lot of equipment being put aboard. Some of the captain's quarters and the other quarters for officers was being changed, and we of course didn't know what was going on, but we knew there was something big was going to happen. Shortly after we left for Europe, we were able to see some of the changes that had been made. At this time, I want to go back and remind you of when the chief, the radio chief, and I didn't get along too well a couple of years or a year or so before that. He had assigned me to the foretop, and I was up there for at least a year, and as I said before, I worked a lot with Lieutenant Curtis, who was also our communications officer. So this particular day, shortly after we'd left port, the communications officer, Lieutenant Curtis, came to the radio shack, and several of us had been called up to meet up there along with the chief. And the radio communications officer, Curtis, said to the chief, that now we were going over for some type of engagements that he would need some different people in different capacities around the ship. And the one place that he needed a man was in what had used to been one of the admiral's quarters, and we didn't know this but found out soon thereafter. It had been turned into a radar and radio shack. Right away, the chief had one of his favorites, Red Hensler, that he wanted to assign that duty, and the Lieutenant Curtis said, no, he said, I'm going to have Don Smith come with me, because he's been working with me the last year or so and knows exactly how to handle this particular type of operation because of the experience we've had in working with planes and spotters and so forth. He told the chief that the chief would have to assign a few radiomen and some radio strikers to work with me, because I would be in charge of the radios and transmitters in the new radio room. Now, of course, you can imagine the reaction that the chief had, because he had thought that by sending me up in a foretop, why, he got me out of the way, and it turned out just the opposite. I had the best experience as far as what we were going to do that any man on the ship in our department had. So you can imagine also how delighted I was that I was going to have such an opportunity. Well, Lieutenant Curtis and the chief and I went down to this room and looked it over, and it was just amazing. It was set up with transmitters, receivers, control desks, phones, a radar screen. There was so much equipment in there that I had never seen and couldn't really comprehend at that time. It was very exciting. So now on the way over to Europe, that would be my general quarters station, and I would have to spend a lot of time getting used to handling the equipment that was in there. I can't remember exactly, but of course we took another convoy over, and it took us probably a week or so to get to England. We went to Plymouth, England, which is in the south of Great Britain. We stayed there in Plymouth for something like a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then we realized, of course, they were getting close to the invasion, because the port was just loaded with all types of ships, including transport ships and all sorts of minesweepers and destroyers. Everything you could imagine was jammed into this port. Now, at the time, of course, England and Germany were fighting, mostly in the air and some on sea. And the Germans had a type of a bomb, and I can't remember exactly what it was called now, but they could shoot it from over in France, and it would drop on cities and places wherever they wanted it to, even though they couldn't direct the bombs like they do with the missiles today. So when they'd send one of these bombs over, you never knew where it was going to land, and they did a lot of destruction. And while we were in port there at Plymouth, we were bombed several times, and some of the ships were hit, but we were lucky we never had any problem. But all of this was in preparation for the invasion of Normandy in France. We, of course, didn't know this, but all up and down the coast, all the way up into Scotland and Reykjavik, Scapa Flow and Orkney, Shetland, all through there it was loaded with ships and barges of all kinds. The Allies had been preparing for this invasion for several years and had built barges. Actually, they had built docks out of concrete, and they had been built on barges, and the barges were to be towed by tugboats. This is something I had never seen until, of course, we got over to Normandy, and I'll try to explain a little bit more about that later. But what I was trying to get at is that everything was planned for months and almost years in advance as to what equipment they were going to need there, and all the various things that could happen, assuming that we were able to land in France. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the commanding officer of all Allied forces. He was stationed in England, and they had many plans, of course, as to what beaches or what part of Normandy they were going to land on and so forth, and who was going to land where, and so on and so forth. And they had what they called two beaches, the Utah and the Omaha Beach. The commander of the Omaha Beach was General Bradley, General Omar Bradley, and he was assigned to our ship along with two admirals. If I remember right, it was Admiral King and Admiral Struble, and they were assigned to our ship for the invasion. Now, General Bradley, of course, was in charge of the Army, the Allied forces that were going to be invading the Omaha Beach. So we were ready to take off this one particular evening. In fact, I think it was June 5th. And everybody was ready, and we had a pretty good idea where we were going, and we were going to leave the morning of June 5th. But we had an awful storm, and they delayed it by one day. In fact, they figured if they didn't go the next day, that we might have to call off the invasion because of the weather conditions that were coming. But we did leave on the morning of June 6th, 1944, and that became D-Day. It was, of course, early in the, or late in the night, or early in the morning, whichever you want to say. It was at dark, and all these ships from all these ports took off about the same time. Fortunately, the Germans weren't aware, of course, that we were going to invade at that time, and they had some of their troops on maneuvers farther inland. Even some of their generals were home on leave. And the Allied forces, Air Force, were started bombing early in the morning, and they also dropped a lot of our spotters by parachute behind the German lines. The ships such as ours opened fire, as did most other large ships. We were probably, I'm not sure the exact distance, but maybe a mile off of the coast of Normandy when we were firing. The troop ships were right along with us, and of course they were unloading their boats full of men to invade the shoreline. All this was coordinated so that it would happen all at the same time, and it was just shortly before daybreak when our troops hit the beach. Now my job was in this radar room, and I had to tune in to the beach masters, which were the fellas that landed with the troops. They would set up a radio as soon as they got on the beach, and they would radio back to their troop ship as to how many of their boats got into land and how many were blown up, and how many were stuck in the water and so forth. And the idea being that these boats that brought the soldiers in, the way they operated, they had an anchor that they would throw out just before they would hit the beach, and then they would unload, they would run the boat practically up on the beach in shallow water. The men would, they put the front of the boat down, and the men would all run down the ramp and up on shore. Then they would pull the ramp back up, and they would use a winch that was hooked up to this anchor, and they'd winch their way back out into the water, and then they would drive back to their transport ship and pick up some more men, and that was the way they transported the men back and forth, back to the beach. Now, of course, if the boats were blown up before they could unload their men, or after they unload their men, then of course they were in the way. So this beach master would report to the transport that he was working with as to how many boats were blown up and so forth. And so they'd know where to land the other boats. Now, my job then was to intercept and the messages that these beach masters were giving to their transport ships, and write it down. Every time I'd hear something, I had to write it down on a tablet, piece of paper, and then I would hand that message to a runner, and he would take it up to the next deck to General Bradley. Now, this was the only way that General Bradley had to know what was going on with his troops, because it was still dark out, and he couldn't see the shore, of course. We did this for about an hour, until finally it was enough light and from the sun, and of course smoke cleared to some extent so that the officers, General Bradley and his men, could see the beach and didn't need these messages anymore, and they could see then how many of their troops were getting ashore. After that, then of course I just manned some of the other radios to do other types of service. There were still strong German forces all along the beach, and they were blowing up these boats and shooting our soldiers as they tried to crawl up the beach. It took several hours for our men to get the beach stabilized to some extent. And even then they were under heavy fire all the time, and we lost an awful lot of men at Normandy. After a day or two, when they finally secured the beach, then General Bradley would go ashore to be with his men during the daytime, and then he'd come back aboard ship in the evening. He did that for several days. I can't remember if it was a week or whatever it was. But we also had aboard our ship a lot of newsmen, various fellas from different papers and radio stations and so forth. And they would go ashore, a few of them at least, would go ashore with General Bradley and his officers every morning. And if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure I'm not, Ernie Pyle was one of those newsmen that was aboard our ship and would go with Bradley. He was later killed in another operation, but he was one of the best in the business. And what they would do when they come back in the evening, then one of these newsmen would be assigned to get on the loudspeaker and report to the crew some of what they had seen during the day. And of course this was really exciting because we were right there, even though we were very safe and had a nice place to sleep and plenty to eat and so forth. We still knew every day what was happening to our troops on the beach. I think I mentioned that we were the flagship, which meant that the admirals that we had aboard ship were in charge of the Navy in that area, and General Bradley was in charge of the Army and Air Force at Omaha Beach. After a few days, when the beach was secured, then one of my jobs was to listen for spotters that were inland behind the German troops. And on occasion I'd get one. This was what they call CW. It wasn't voice control, it was CW by code. And we had different cue signals that we would send out and looking for some of these fellas, or they would be sending signals out asking for someone to talk to them by code, of course. And on several occasions I had the opportunity to contact these spotters, and usually it was at night because they had to hide at night, and then they would send messages as to what they saw as far as the troops were concerned, German troops and so forth. And that was kind of exciting. And then also I worked with some of the airplanes for spotting. And also I could listen to the Air Force, some of the Air Force pilots when they were speaking, and I got a kick out of the English. We call them limeys, and they used some pretty strong language on the air, which most of our men didn't do, but it was kind of fun to listen to them. And one time I heard a couple of them coming down, strafing German troops and so forth, and it was kind of exciting. Well, we stayed there for, as I said, a week or so. Can't remember exactly how long we were there. And then we headed down the coast to, went to Africa, to Oran in North Africa. And we spent a day or two there. I got ashore and went swimming one day. And that was rather interesting because here these Arabs all wore kind of long white robes. They didn't wear conventional clothes like Americans did. And it was easy to sell our mattress covers to them because they would take and slit a hole in the top of the mattress cover, and then two holes in the side for their arms, and that's what they would wear. And so you'd see these Arabs walking around with our mattress covers on. It looked kind of silly to me, but they all had to wear something like a robe. And it was hot there. It was terribly hot, but I enjoyed seeing that part of North Africa. And then from there we went, we were there a couple of days, then we went across the Mediterranean over to Sicily, to Palermo. And we were in Palermo for a couple of days, well, maybe just 2 days, I believe, in Palermo. And then we went to Naples in Italy. And of course that was interesting also. One of the things that I got kind of a kick out of at that time, we could buy cigarettes aboard ship for a nickel a pack. There, of course, was no tax in those days, and the cigarette companies supplied these cigarettes to the armed forces, and I'm sure they didn't make any money at a nickel a pack, but that's what we could buy them for. But when you go ashore, like in Italy or even in Sicily and some other places, they were worth about $2 a pack. It would be American dollars. So when we'd go ashore, we'd try to load up on cigarettes so we could use it to barter with and so forth on the beach. And when I was going over in Naples, why, I had put a couple of packs of cigarettes in each stocking on the side of my leg, and then you'd have to know about Navy uniforms. There's no pockets to speak of in them, so I had them inside my jumper. I had a few and a couple around my waistband, and I probably had a dozen packs of cigarettes. So we had to take a little boat to get over on the shore, and we went over and hit the beach, and then you walk through the naval base there a little bit, the port, and then you come to a big fence, and and that's to keep the Italians, of course, out away from our ships. And once you go through the gate, why, then you're in Naples. And there was, you know, a bunch of us walking along. We went through the gate, and as soon as, there was a bunch of kids there. We didn't pay much attention to them. But as soon as we got through the gate, these kids each had someone picked out, and they would run at us, jump down on the ground by our legs, and flip the cigarettes out of our stockings, and they were gone. And it only took seconds for that to happen, and I lost 4 packs of cigarettes. To them, they were worth about $2.50 a piece, so that was an awful lot of money for them. End of tape 2, 4 stories.